Здравствуйте.
Hello. Yes, in recent times, many questions have been coming about Stalin. Well, I understand that now is such a time. 25 years have passed, that is, a whole generation has grown up since August 1991. And in essence, we are now situated in that same period in which we were in 1991, but with a different sign. Discussions about the role of Stalin in history, they are not just hot. As it is said, some people break their brains. We know there is such an expression about the role of personality in history. Evaluations. I'll simply give you some from this morning. In the well-known to all program hosted by Solovyov, the latter put to a vote the attitude towards Stalin. The proposed options. He was a great politician, he was a tyrant, or he was an ordinary statesman. The results of this vote: 67% were of the opinion that Stalin was a great politician, 16% voted for the option that Stalin was a tyrant, and 17% said that Stalin was simply an ordinary statesman. If we add 17% and 67%, we get 84%. This is despite the fact that Solovyov himself, before putting the question to a vote, clearly expressed his attitude towards Stalin. A tyrant, with no reflection on this topic. On TV they show endless talk shows, again with the participation of Solovyov, Minaev, and others, and all the time this question is raised. When they receive the results of voting in a prepared audience, not just simply gathered, they get 84% in favor of Stalin being a great politician, and 16% for being a tyrant. Now I will say a few words about my impression, because when Stalin died, the official date of death was March the 5th, I remember it very well, despite the fact that in 1953 I was only 15 years old. I was fully aware of what was happening. I remember that day well. The weather was such where a wet snow falls. All the personnel, Suvorovites, teachers, service personnel, there were about 1,000 people, stood on the parade ground. And that feeling that embraced me, I saw it embraced everyone. It was a common feeling. What feeling? You understand, we lived, like all children of this age, our own lives. And suddenly, an extraordinary feeling of terrible loss. I personally experienced this feeling, then we discussed it together, the guys and me. Something had come to pass that was beyond our understanding. What would happen now? Who would lead the state? How? And how would our life change? Only one thing was clear. It would be for the worse and not for the better. Therefore, all discussions on this theme, who is Stalin, generally these concern only the person. In our sufficiently general theory of governance, there is such a concept: the probability of events and probabilistic predetermination. Probability is abstract and in no way colored by personality. But probabilistic predetermination is always colored by personality. That is, the personality is directly involved. And nobody talks about this. But there is one more thing. It is more serious. When people compare the personalities of Stalin, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, they have the wrong idea. I would put the question differently. We wrote an article, I believe it was in May 2011, about which clans were fighting for power in Russia during the 100-year period from 1911 to 2011. There we described all the clans. Never can a single person achieve power just like that. Cannot seize power just like that. Usually the one who rises to supreme power is the nominee of a certain clan. For myself, I have long since, by the way, after Stalin's death, and this will seem strange, but I have formed a certain rule: to monitor the correlation between the measure of understanding of a person and the measure of understanding of the clan that put this person forward. A lot depends on this. The measure of understanding of a person can be higher than the measure of understanding that is characteristic of a clan. The measure of understanding of a person can be comparable to the measure of understanding of the clan. The measure of understanding of the person may be lower than the measure of understanding that is characteristic of a clan. Subsequently, I memorized this formula for myself, wrote it out, and then compared it. After all, I lived during the time of Stalin, during the time of Khrushchev. I already served on ships then. During the time of Brezhnev, I remember the death of Brezhnev. I remember when Andropov came, how Gorbachev appeared later. I don't talk about Chernenko anymore, these are minor episodes. Then came the time of Yeltsin, then Putin came. And this is the long period covered by my life. And I always recalled and compared this formula. And the following happened. An example of the measure of understanding of a person being higher than the measure of understanding of the clan that nominated him. This is Stalin. And which clan nominated him? After all, this is a very complicated, intertwined story. Stalin never created such a post as the post of General Secretary. He always signed documents as the Secretary of the Central Committee. And the post of General Secretary was invented by Comrade Lenin. Well, about the questions of which clan nominated Comrade Stalin to power. It was a struggle between two clans. At that time, we had a fierce struggle between two clans, the clan of the Bolsheviks and the clan of the Trotskyists. And that is what amazed me later during Perestroika. All the crimes that were committed in Russia by the Trotskyists were attributed to the Bolsheviks without division, without discrimination. Again and again they shouted, Bolshevik, Bolshevik, Bolsheviks. I look at the hysterics of Zhirinovsky, who screams, be silent when I speak, these Bolsheviks, these communists. Well, and I'll right away make a reservation. In our country, in the USSR, not all party members were communists, and not all communists were party members. Such a phrase carries meaning, but what should be understood by it? That the people who did not belong to the party with convictions of the communists were perhaps even more than 20 million. Otherwise it would have been impossible to build the society that was built during the time of Stalin. I assert, and I can prove it as it suits, that by the time of Perestroika, all the members of the Central Committee, members of the Politburo, including Gorbachev personally, as well as those who nominated him, were not all communists. They all came to the party for the sake of career, and the benefits that this career allowed. Thus, Gorbachev managed to destroy the USSR, and therefore, the attitude towards him is negative. At the moment there is a celebration of his 85th birthday. And what passions are burning? The most accurate assessment of Gorbachev's activities was given by A.S. Pushkin in the unfinished 10th chapter of Eugene Onegin. A ruler, timorous and wily, a bolding fop, of toil a foe, minion of fame by chance entirely, reigned over us those years ago. This, of course, was written in relation to Alexander I, who fled from power before the Decembrist uprising, but Gorbachev also fled. A ruler timorous and wily, a bolding fop, of toil a foe, minion of fame by chance entirely, reigned over us those years ago. Well, you can't say it more precisely. And in these heated discussions, it was immediately clear who supported the collapse of the Soviet Union. These people, as expected, also supported Gorbachev. And so two clans fought, the clan of the Bolsheviks and the clan of the Trotskyists. How did the Bolshevik clan, which came to power during the October Revolution together with the Trotskyists, manage to defeat the Trotskyists? About this there is little written, And this speaks of the intelligence and genius of Stalin. The Trotskyists imposed in the early 1930s a discussion where the question arose: will Russia participate in the world revolution like brushwood, or will it build socialism in one country? Naturally, the Trotskyists were on the side of the so-called permanent revolution. But Comrade Stalin already realized that such a scenario would mean death for Russia, and the Trotskyists imposed the discussion in the hope that at the enterprises, the discussion took place at the enterprises, that because they were so smart, that they knew so much, they would be able to brainwash the workers, the peasants of yesteryear. Because the peasants came to the cities to become workers. Take my parents, my mother, my father. They were from the village of Nizhny Novgorod region, and of such there were many. And at this time, what is Stalin doing? They write and talk little about this. He announces Lenin's appeal to the party, and immediately they accept 300,000 ordinary workers. And the workers listen to such discussions. They say the Russian peasant is strong in hindsight. And after all, there was no television. The radio was not everywhere. So a simple worker listens to these discussions, and calmly he argues. And why do I need this? Why do I need what the Trotskyists are proposing? And he votes for the Bolshevik line. If we are to build socialism, then let us do it in one country, and not wait for the whole world to be in a socialist revolution. That is, one should put things in order in one's own country. So the Bolsheviks won, and Stalin factually seized power and was victorious. Indeed, in the 1930s, before Trotsky was expelled from the USSR in 1929, Stalin was an everyman, and yet the question of who would win remained: the Trotskyists or the Bolsheviks, because the entire apparatus in the armed forces, the entire bureaucracy, had already been captured by the Trotskyists, and for Stalin it was very complex. But the Bolsheviks won, carried out collectivization, industrialization, defeated in a terrible war not only fascist Germany, but the entire West. The entire West was defeated. Now they say that then it was necessary to surrender to the Germans, like the French, who, 2 weeks after the start of the invasion of the Germans into the territory of France, were already going to cafes with the Germans, living wonderfully. They would have arranged blockades for us, they say. We would have endured them, and that's it. All who say so do not understand one thing. If we had surrendered, the Nazis would have treated us differently from the French. In relation to us, there would have been total destruction. With such reasoning, by the way, Jews very often sin. During one of the discussions, I don't remember who exactly, one of the participants said in relation to Jews, "You ought to bow down at the feet of Stalin for saving you from total destruction." So we won the Second World War. In 5 years they pulled off the incredible. Of course, not everything was destroyed, but the main part of the European territory of the USSR was lifted out of ruin. The rationing system was cancelled, prices began to decline. With regard to price cuts, liberals today say that this was PR. My goodness, PR. They did not live at that time, but I lived. I remember very well what it was. This is from 1947 to 1953. It was incredible. It raised the spirit of the people so much. Why? Because the most important feeling rose up, which is now lost. Confidence in tomorrow. My father died at the front. My mother had 3 children. She worked 3 shifts, morning, evening and night. The budget was of course insignificant. The pension was paid for 3 children. But we could plan how much to spend on food, how much to leave for clothes, which is a great thing. Who can plan for their future now? Now no one is sure of their future, neither the millionaire who stole, nor the simple hard worker. money depreciates very quickly. The growth of the gross domestic product during Stalin's time was 20% per annum. The West, USA, Great Britain were simply in a panic. This had to stop. And, of course, Stalin was killed. And then also, without a trial and investigation, they also don't talk about this yet. They keep silent about this. Beria was also killed. Even the Russian historian Yevgeny Spitsin, not a supporter of traditional history and a supporter of Stalin, when he touches on this period, he says, well, there are two variants. He was killed without trial or investigation, and there are versions that he was arrested, tried, and so on. I personally adhere to the version that Lavrentiy Beria was killed in his own home without trial or investigation. When there is no access to archived data, there are always some markers on how you can check what exactly happened. It's very simple. Beria's son, according to his own stories, when it was suggested that he flee abroad, refused, because he understood that if he escaped, it would be the same thing as admitting the guilt of his father, when his father was not guilty. Another example, the son of Khrushchev fled abroad, and there is the whole score. True, there are still other things by which it's possible to judge. For instance, the funeral. Now imagine, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, they all had funerals when they died. But for more than 1 million people to take to the streets of Moscow when Stalin died, and the grief of these people was sincere, one should not think that someone forced them. All the talk of the liberals that Khrushchev allegedly freed the country from fear, this is all speculation. I watched one such discussion. Vitaly Tretyakov correctly said, the people did not have such fear. You attribute your fears, meaning the Moscow intelligentsia, to the entire people. And I will tell you from my own feelings. In Company 75, in School 575, this is a very broad geography of the Suvorov School in the city of Gorky. We never heard from anyone in our midst of suffering from Stalin's repressions. There was no such thing. In fact, the repressions mainly concerned the intelligentsia. The liberals still cannot understand why now, when they have been slandering Stalin for 25 years, people approve more and more of his activities. And for 40 years they have tried two methods. At first they were silent, and then they poured mud for 25 years. And the effect is completely the opposite. The authority of Stalin only grew among the people. The ones who slander cannot understand why. This is because Stalin defended the people precisely from this liberal intelligentsia, which has always been pro-Western and which has never understood the Russian people. Yes, of course, there were arrests. Really, can we say that this never happened after the revolution? Or did the former ruling classes immediately reconcile themselves after the revolution? Nothing of the kind. Or did we not have criminality? There was such rampant criminality. And what, now there are fewer people in prisons? Solovyov said in today's program, now there are even more. And yet why is there such an attitude towards Stalin? But I would pose a completely different question. Considering the victories won by the Bolsheviks led by Stalin, it is clear that the measure of understanding of Comrade Stalin in relation to the clan that nominated him was much higher. My comrades and I, we believed that Stalin was at least 100 years ahead of his era. Stalin is still ahead. But the question I would pose is this. It is perhaps more important. How did it happen that after so many victories in 1953, because the assassination of Stalin is already the final stage, the Bolshevik clan lost, conceded to the clan of the Trotskyists? Khrushchev was and always remained a Trotskyist. He was never a communist. Because there are communist Trotskyists and there are communist Bolsheviks. These are different things. Why did the Bolshevik clan lose? What happened? Even the good historian Yevgeny Spitsin did not answer this important question. He provides many interesting facts, but does not even raise such a question. So I would like everyone who listens to this video to think about this question. We have an answer to this question. It's not so simple. There are two factors. The first factor was highlighted by Molotov before his death in the interview, "They began to luxuriate." What is this about? The top of the Bolsheviks, for whom it was necessary to live ascetically after the war, especially under the influence of their wives, you know who their wives were, and their kids began to travel abroad. They saw there how life was. They understood that Russia is a very rich country, and why can't we dispose of this wealth? And what was Stalin doing? This is also not mentioned anywhere in all these discussions. About this there is no talk. He gave executive employees magnificent apartments, cars, summer cottages, but this was not their private property. It was all state-owned. Even the furniture there was state-owned, and this annoyed them. But what did he not give them? Money. Stalin did not give them money. Khrushchev, though, gave them the opportunity to steal and gain money. After all, the reforms that he carried out contributed to the enrichment of the elite. For example, the reform of 1961. I remember this well. I was already quite a mature person. I was a third-year student of the shipbuilding faculty of the Dzerzhinsky School. So then a denomination was carried out. 1 0 was removed from the ruble. That is, prices were reduced tenfold and the wages went up. Naturally, prices were raised at the same time. And in the market, prices were reduced not tenfold, but only 2 times. And what happened? It turned out that store directors could now store products in short supply, caviar, smoked meats, etc., and put them on the market or distribute to these elites. In addition, there were also special stores. Such reforms allowed the elite to receive money. And it's not necessary to interpret all this from the point of view of some kind of economic science. We do not have any science of economics. There is only a certain incantation over the market, how to use this science to extract money from the pockets of people by those who do not work, who live at the expense of others. No one will believe that you can honestly earn 1 million now, let alone billions, and there is nothing more to it. This is laughable. And I could demonstrate this on my fingers right now. I remember that I spoke at the Islamic University of Kuala Lumpur, and there was one doctor of economics who flew in from Australia specifically for this meeting. He himself is English, but he had been in Australia. And he was ranting there about all these things related to the economy, and I demonstrated it there on the chalkboard. Suppose you were appointed Prime Minister. He laughs. Good, he says. I say, we will now verify whether this is good or not good for you. Well, the audience there were students. By the way, there were many women, teachers. The university is very well equipped. So I ask him, here you are the Prime Minister. In the West, the Prime Ministers are analogous to presidents here, or even more powerful. And so you have produced such a volume of products in a year, and a year later, due to increased labor productivity, new technologies, organization of labor, you receive a small supplement. The question for you, as the Prime Minister, and for the entire audience, what would you do with this supplementary product? Print more money or lower prices? He says, of course I would print more money. I say, and I would lower prices. He says, why? Because in Russia, not in Malaysia, but in Russia, we have been through this period. After all, if I cut the prices, even if not by much, then the poor will become a little richer, and the rich will not become poorer. If I print money rather than lower prices, Then the money will simply flow from the pockets of those who work into the pockets of those who know how to make money. And this is what we have. Therefore, everyone who listens and watches should not be surprised that our prices are growing, since more money is printed on this supplementation. I won't go into this because this is a separate conversation, but I will say that we can print no more money than we have dollars. Our economy is actually closed onto the US economy through the central bank. We return again to this question: why did the Bolsheviks lose? About the first factor, I have already spoken. Because they began to luxuriate, as Molotov answered towards the end of his life. But the second factor is more complicated. Comrade Stalin did not have a conception with which he could come out to the people. We have such a work, Does the Garden Grow by Itself?, which is devoted to the process of convergence. In the theory of convergence interaction, the interaction and mutual influence of two economic systems of capitalism and socialism in the course of the scientific and technological revolution were considered as the main factor in the movement of these systems towards a kind of hybrid mixed system, which, as the theory suggests, should be free from the defects of each of them and keep the virtues of both. Convergence was not proposed by the USSR, not by the leadership of the USSR, and the people generally knew nothing about it. Convergence was suggested by the West. This was at some time in the 1970s. Those who oversaw the West knew very well that the West was developing according to the biblical conception, and that Marxism, which was officially on the signboard of the USSR, was simply a secular expression of the same biblical conception. If the leadership of the USSR had agreed to converge, then convergence would still have taken place as a process within the framework of a certain conception. Then the Marxistic nonsense of the biblical conception would have been dissolved. And in fact, the victory of the West was a foregone conclusion. The Helsinki Accords were signed, stating that all borders will remain, that it's time to end the wars, otherwise we'll ruin the entire globe in a thermonuclear war. Well, what can we say about Gorbachev? He was nominated by a completely different clan. The destruction of the USSR, as some correctly point out, began with the assassination of Stalin and the assassination of Beria. And you cannot reproach Comrade Stalin for not doing something there. I am already 4 years older than he was, and I can judge what a person can and cannot do. He, of course, could still do a lot, but he was already in danger, because the idea that such rates of economic development of the USSR would continue further. Moreover, the fact that the socialist camp had already been formed. All this frightened the West. So this thought first took shape in me when the Second Front opened. What was the situation there? Our troops had already crossed our border. Already they were moving through the territories of Germany and Poland. And our allies decided to help us already at the end. There was the landing in Normandy, but the Germans were good fighters, not like now. As they fought back hard, our allies fled. And if not for Stalin, our troops stopped to regroup before the last dash and the capture of Berlin. And Churchill and Roosevelt prayed to Stalin for help. Stalin had every reason to say to them, "Well, listen, this is too much. We have just liberated the territory of the USSR. The troops are tired. Now we will regroup, so wait a month or two. Feel on your own skin what the military machine, not only of Hitler, but the whole of Western Europe is like. Then let us have a rest, and then we will help." What are 2 months when we have been waiting for the opening of the Second Front for 3 years? Well, wait a month. Well, 2. Well, let us recover at least a little. But Stalin, firstly, understood that if he did not launch an offensive on Berlin, which should have been no earlier than a month later, the Germans would have thrown the entire Allied landing back into the Atlantic, and if the Americans and British fled from the Germans, then they would not have been able to organize such a landing a second time. But this is not even the point. The art of a real leader is the ability to foresee what will happen further down the line and what comes next. Of course, I am not Stalin, but I believe that he reasoned something like this. Well, fine. Let's suppose I don't help them. The Germans will repel them back into the Atlantic. It will be difficult for them to reorganize a second landing. But in this case, the power of our army allows us to do it. We'll go through all of Germany and liberate France. Because fascism existed not only in France and Germany, but also in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. But that is not even the point. Why did I start talking about the conception? That is because further reasoning was most likely like this. And with what will we come to Europe, where the standard of living is much higher? Many say that Stalin was frightened, but in reality it could hardly have scared him. He was a sober-minded politician who knew how to think about the future and assume what might happen next. With what will I come? With Marxism? So, I will come with Marxism. But Stalin then understood that Marxism was just a trick. And although he used Marxist terminology, he already understood that from the point of view of the political economy of Marxism, no society can be built in prosperity. And again we come back to the fact that he did not have an alternative to the biblical conception. After all, unlike many leaders of his day, he graduated with honors from a theological seminary, and he knew the Bible very well. I believe he was one of the first to understand that Marxism is a secular version of the biblical conception. So the elite began to luxuriate and betrayed all the proclaimed ideals, while the people were committed to them. And secondly, there was the absence of a conception. And nonetheless, we don't have any complaints against Comrade Stalin. Under all these conditions, he could not sit down and write a conception, but this period formed the conditions for the creation of a conception, an alternative to the biblical one. And despite the fact that everyone considers the conception of social safety, more than 65 books written, many serious articles, to be one of the conspiracy theories, many people say that the conception of social safety, this is a conspiracy theory. And when Mikhail Kovalchuk spoke before the Federal Assembly on September the 30th, but for some reason his speech was only shown on February the 8th, this is a mystery to us. In fact, he presented a conspiracy project. Of course, he did not present from the standpoint of the conception of social safety, but he spoke about what we have been talking about already for 25 years. He spoke about the fact that the technosphere came into conflict with the biosphere, that an elite and a service society were being created. Well, this happened already in the time of Atlantis. And those who created this biblical conception, they could not create anything else. But the members of the Federal Assembly applauded Kovalchuk because he posed the question, where is our place in this elite? These are naive people. They think that they will be allowed into this elite. They will not be allowed there under any circumstances. Well, and now just a few words, although we are talking about Stalin. On the 15th, the Ides of March begin. Strange, but it was not only Julius Caesar, stabbed to death right there in the Senate building in 44 BC, who was killed in the Ides of March. For some reason, both Stalin and Emperor Paul I, yes, there are many if you look back in history, you can find many historical figures who died in March. So I would like everyone who listens to me to pay attention to a small story, the testament of the German writer Hans Erich Nossak, the testament of Lucius Everin. What is this story about? It is quite wordy, lengthy, but there is one very interesting part, the conversation of this Lucius Everin. If it happened or not, this is another matter. Lucius Everin was the supreme judge of Rome. He talked with a certain preacher who was 75 years old. That is, he was older than Stalin, but younger than me. The thing is that Christianity had already been there for about 200 years. For a long time I could not understand why all this attracted me. It was only when I read it for the second time that I noticed the character of Marcus Aurelius. This is the Roman emperor who died in 180 AD. This is the only philosopher-emperor. True, Julian the Apostate tried to be that way. So what in all this is interesting? Those who have read our last note, there we go into detail about the fact that there exists a biosphere, there is a noosphere, and there is a technosphere. I will not repeat it, but I highly recommend reading this article. For me, when I read about the emperor Marcus Aurelius, alluding to his last will and testament, a very interesting episode came suddenly to me. It was in the 1980s, in 81 or 82. At that time I had the idea to write a conversation between Marcus Aurelius and Jesus Christ. Who was Marcus Aurelius? This was a philosopher of polytheism, or in our terminology, of Vedic pseudo-Jretshood. But to write this conversation, I had to find his book. It is a small one named Meditations. And so I went to the bookstores, I searched, I also looked in libraries, but I could not find it anywhere. And one day in one bookstore, a Jew who sold books there, he comes up to me and asks, "Do you need Marcus Aurelius?" I say, "Yes, and do you have him?" "Yes," he says, "but only at home. You have to come with me." Well, we went to his place, he showed me this book. So it is called Meditations, Thoughts to Myself. Well, at that time, even very serious books cost 10, a maximum of 15 rubles. He demanded 25 rubles for this one. It's good that I had this money with me then. I usually carried around 10 to 15 rubles. But here, for some reason, I had these 25 rubles. So I pay for the book, and he asks me, "Why do you need it?" Well, I told him so out of the simplicity of my soul. Here I want to bring the polytheistic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, together with the monotheistic philosopher Jesus Christ, into a conversation. You have no idea what happened to him. He fell into hysterics, tried to take the book away from me, shouting, "Why? What are you up to? This is insanity, one could just die." And the essence of the testament of Aurelius is as follows. This chief judge finds out that his wife has become a Christian, and he meets with this bishop. This all proceeds over just a few pages. The bishop is from Greece. He is 75 years old. This conversation is very interesting in the sense that unexpectedly it is Lucius Everin who says, "Yes, I understand that sooner or later you will conquer the whole world." And with himself he reasons, "I still have 20 to 30 years to live." He was then about 40 years old. By our standards, he was still a very young man. He had a daughter, a son. But for himself, he understood that this would conquer the whole world. Yes, it was not the true teaching of Jesus Christ that conquered the whole world, but the historically established Christianity, which was planted in Rome by Constantine the Great, when at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, he forced 220 church hierarchs to a vote, delivering an ultimatum. "Until you vote on whether Jesus is a god or a man, I will not let you out." Well, from 220, 218 were for Jesus being a god, while 2 abstained, apparently observers. So there we have the Nicene Creed. But there was not a single word about the teaching of Jesus Christ. So this supreme judge, having conversed with this bishop, decided to commit suicide. One could just die. And there is a very interesting explanation as to why he committed suicide. I will not retell it. Those who wish will find. Then the epochs of polytheism, Vedic pseudo-Jretsud, were replaced by historically established Christianity. We are now on the brink of another change of epochs. This historically established Christianity, which has been developing for more than 2,000 years on the basis of the Bible, the biblical conception. Based on this conception, a corresponding culture emerged. Culture plays the role for each new generation entering life that a potter plays in relation to clay. Well, now I understand why he wrote what he did. How does the writing of such things proceed? There exists a noosphere. We wrote about this in the article. This is a collection or set of egregors from family, tribal, narrowly professional, religious, and national egregors of all mankind. This is what the noosphere is. But all the information there exists in the form of images, in pictures, and different creative people catch these pictures. This is what Pushkin expressed at the end of the preface of The Little House in Kolomna. I am a reckless rhymer. I got rid of this difficult octave. He makes it clear that everything is imagery at the unconscious levels of the psyche. He was catching something from the noosphere, where there is neither a past nor a future. When Atlantis was forming, there was also a noosphere. In the noosphere, there is a plant segment, an animal segment, and a human segment. And why were there different gods in the nomes, the regions of ancient Egypt? Crocodile, scarab beetle, monkey, ibis. Because people had some idea of development. Some believed that they came from a monkey, others believed they came from something else. This is called a totem animal. In Russia, the bear is the totem animal. We are from the bear. And Putin said that the bear would not yield to anyone its own tiger. So this writer, Nosak, caught this change of epochs only in images. He felt, thanks to certain images, that some kind of change of epoch was on the horizon. But what could he know from history? Because if we are talking about the future, he started his search in history. And he knew of only one change of epochs in history, the transition from polytheism to monotheism. And so he wrote in the story, whether this was his will or not, or if this supreme judge actually committed suicide or not, we do not know. But he saw it like that. But there is another similar example. Everyone has seen the film Vabank. We thought that Quinto's son wrote this script. It turns out that he wrote it himself. In this film, he played a role. How did this take shape? I repeat once again, creative people catch information from there, from the noosphere, from egregors. And he also felt the coming change of epochs. And again the question, what did he know? By that time, fascism had ended. It seemed that Europe had ceased to be fascist. And he described this in images. A film was shot according to the script, and everyone saw it. Have you noticed that during the 25 years of Perestroika, the film was shown several times a year? And on the eve of 2016, it was shown twice, almost 2 days in a row. Such is the technology of this matter. Well, now I return to Stalin. As I said, Stalin overtook his clan and everyone living in the USSR for 100 years. And those who hysterically say that Stalin was a great tyrant, a murderer, they never understood, and they will pass away without understanding. Stalin is still ahead of his time, and about this it is said, Stalin did not walk away into the past, he dissolved into the future. At one of my speeches, I said, with a certain concentration in society, this future is realized. Anyone who asks the question, would you like to live in the time of Stalin? It should be said that this question is initially foolish, although some of the young people answer, I would like to. However much one wants it, one cannot return to the past. Moreover, there is the fact that the past is multifaceted, and that one person sees one face, while the other sees a different one. And now the representatives of the visions of different faces are fighting amongst themselves, and the West is also goading. However, the future is multivariate, and the likelihood that a variant with a very low probability will be realized may not be 1. After all, the probability of the future is equal to 1. That is, whatever happens, some future will take place. However, there are hundreds of possible variants for realization. Any one of them can be embodied. So the variant with a very low probability can be 1/100%. But the likelihood that the variant needed by the whole society will come true is a probabilistic predetermination. It is always personally colored. Many works have been written about the role of personality in history. They do not reveal anything, but Stalin, with his presence and his personality, played a big role in history. We have thought a lot about this. I will express only my personal opinion. Stalin lived in a very difficult era. We named this era a change in the standard frequencies of biological and social time. I won't talk about this in detail now. There have been many speeches on this topic. By the way, this phenomenon, the change of epochs through the changing of the reference frequencies of biological and social time, remains hitherto unspoken of, although the discovery of this phenomenon is an epoch-making discovery. This is essentially the time when the technosphere began to form. This is the first half of the 20th century. It was precisely during this period that 2 world wars took place. Revolutions swept the globe. And in general, the world community was in a state of great excitement, agitation. At the end of this period, there appeared atomic weapons. And thanks to the fact that such a leader, such a figure appeared at the head of the USSR Russia, it was possible to preserve not only Russia as the Russian civilization, but the whole world. Although the last statement will not be realized soon. I could speak a lot on this matter. If we translate it into technical language, then this phenomenon was close to resonance. If we bear in mind that the construction of humanity possesses its own oscillatory frequency, the frequency of generational change, but the moment came when this frequency of generational change equaled the frequency of external forced oscillations. These are technologies, that is, oscillations of the technosphere. This was a very dangerous time, which was calculated in the distant past, by our estimate about 7,000 years ago, by the Hierophants who governed ancient Egypt, and which some representatives of obscurantism in science describe as it pleases them. I'm talking about the article which appeared in the tabloid newspaper Fontankaroo, under the name The Agrarian University and the Conspiracy of the Egyptian Jretzes. Lunacy in science is now simply off scale. Although they do not understand that now in every scientific field, a kind of alternative science is being born. This explains the existence of a committee on pseudoscience, but this will not change anything. That which is predetermined will come to pass. We are now sure that now, like this Lucius Everin, who understood that the popularization of Christianity could not be stopped, that the change of epochs could not be stopped, although he reasoned from the position that this would not happen in the next 20 to 30 years, that is, in his lifetime. So he figured he had enough time. And we are also sure that the change of epochs cannot be stopped. This is the main question. And the second question. Why was there no protection for Stalin from above? Well, Stalin fulfilled his mission, and those who are calling for Stalin to come back now, and those who are afraid of Stalin's coming. They don't understand that now a collective Stalin is needed, and this collective will govern in a completely different way than was done over that difficult period, where the change of the reference frequencies of biological and social time was underway. It would govern in a completely different way. We have such a work. The time has come, I begin the story of Stalin. It was a strange state I had at the time of writing. It took me 10 days to write it, during which time dreams of Stalin came to me, and I talked to him. In general, an unusual state, and until the time that the work, The Time Has Come, I Begin the Story of Stalin, was finished, these dreams continued. And I met with Vladimir Rodolfovich Solovyov, at his request, on April the 30th, 2000. We met in one of those suburban Chinese restaurants. He was present with Gordon. We talked for about an hour and a half, and at the end I presented him with this book, The Time Has Come, I Begin the Story of Stalin. And the fact that he began his broadcast, where he put the question to a vote about who Stalin was, by saying that Stalin was definitely a tyrant, he added some other words there. I don't quite remember. But this says a lot. Speaking of Pushkin, I can't imagine him at 70. Prince Pyotr Andreevich Vyazemsky, if I am not mistaken, he lived for more than 70 years. But he was a bilious and evil old man. After all, he was also a poet, and if you read his poems, then you can find out that he was constantly reproaching God for something. Studying the works of Pushkin and Vyazemsky, I came to the conclusion that in many ways, in this murder of Pushkin, his best friend, in quotation marks, Pyotr Andreevich Vyazemsky, also played a role. He was not a stupid person. He was 7 years older than Pushkin. That is, when Pushkin began to publish, he was already a famous poet in Russia. But Pushkin immediately overshadowed Vyazemsky. Despite the difference of 7 years, which at that age is a very big difference. Imagine Pushkin, when he graduated from the Lyceum, 17, 18 years old, and Vyazemsky is already 25. I remember, I had a teacher at school. He was also 27 years old and I was 20. Also, the difference in our ideas was big, although I can say that we were friends. And Pushkin wrote once to Vyazemsky, "My friend, do not write so cleverly." Well, and then he wrote a play, even when he was in exile in Mikhailovsky. The play was called Envy, and then he called it Mozart and Salieri, where in fact Vyazemsky and Pushkin were represented. I thought that I was the only one to guess it. But then it turned out that this play had already been staged in such a way that the role of Mozart was Pushkin and Salieri was Vyazemsky. There was Envy. He, of course, did not undergo any initiations. These are all idle speculations. And this is not the main thing in Stalin's life. He was a man with a very difficult fate, but, of course, amazing abilities, to work as much as he worked. And he worked for the blago of the whole people and the country. Well, the intelligentsia suffered from him. After all, he turned to literature, and to painting, and to music, and especially to cinema. Well, the screenwriters and directors then were Jews. But the films, Ivan the Terrible, Peter I, Stalin carefully studied all this. Whether they wanted it or not, they were forced to pursue the line that Comrade Stalin suggested to them. No magus has fear of the mightiest lords, no welcomes their gifts when they're given. Authentic and free are our Vatical words, and matched to the wisdom of heaven. This is the most accurate expression of those who are called жрецы. The word жрец comes from the word жизненная речь, and the closest translation for this is soothsaying. I remember how, at the beginning of Perestroika, a pastor came from America, and I could not explain to him the word жрец, since he has the word priest. And once I explained to him in more detail the meaning of this word, that the jrets is matched with the wisdom of heaven, then he said that there is no such word in English that would contain this concept. Yes, this is also good evidence. Nor did his daughter Svetlana, who fled abroad, find any accounts. There were only a couple of worn-out boots, one or two suits. There was some money on the table. But Yeltsin and his whole family still live in mansions, just like Gorbachev, who received a lot of money for his betrayal. And one should not think that he did this all out of ignorance. He knew and understood everything. Here the words a ruler, timorous and wily are exactly characteristic of Gorbachev. I recommend reading The Last Gambit to look into this more attentively. The leadership of the KGB spoke about Gorbachev literally in 1985, a few months after the photograph had appeared in the Trud newspaper on the victory day of the entire Central Committee. The Politburo with Gorbachev on the podium and with a half skull between Ligachev and Tereshkova. We explained why this happened. In the Russian language, the phrase, his roof left him, means someone went crazy. Therefore, this is a man, as it's shown symbolically in the newspaper Trud, who has gone crazy and will destroy the USSR. That was on May 9, 1985. And in my own unit, where they adopted social obligations for a 5-year plan, we calculated when the USSR would be destroyed through the development of the financial credit system from 1940 to 1985. We then identified a tendency, and it turned out that in 1990-1991, the USSR would collapse, and there would be no more party. So I drew up this table for the party activists who adopted social obligations. And when we started voting for or against, I alone raised my hand. Everyone was surprised. Why did you raise your hand, they say. The table had been drawn far away with chalk. It was hard to see. I then got up. I went to this table and explained what kind of table it was. It was then that such was the degree of understanding of the officers. At that time, the party activists consisted of 300 people. Then everyone pounced on me. The head of the political department called and ordered me to hand over the party card. In general, they pressed me as best they could. But I explained, then someone explained to them, and then life itself explained to them. But on the 75th anniversary of this office which I served, they all gathered. Then the head of the department was alive. There were officers who were still alive from those with whom I served. Because at such moments everyone is mainly engaged in drinking and remembering, oh, how good it was then. I say, well, okay. Since you are remembering, maybe remember the party activists of 1985. Then to the head of the department, who was over 90 years old at the time, I asked, what did I say back then? You always reminisce about the past, but who will think about the future? I spoiled the holiday with this question. I could say a lot about the future of Russia. Of course, our great poet Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin wrote a lot about this. In addition to Pushkin, there was also Fyodor Ivanovich Tyutchev. Here he wrote the following lines about Karamzin. This is 150 years ago. Able to bring all together into an unbreakable whole structure, everything humanly good, reinforcing it with Russian feeling. This expression of his, written 150 years ago, on the day of Karamzin, elucidates another expression that many do not understand. Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone. No ordinary yardstick can span her greatness. She stands alone, unique. In Russia, one can only believe. I remember well the proceedings of the Institute of Independent Experts, where I spoke before the September 20 coup of 1993. I was given the floor there. I began my speech with this: Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone. I read this aloud and explained what the matter was about. Pushkin again has elucidations. Pushkin was able to explain in an unusually brief way the crux of the matter. From the coachman to the first poet, we all sing ruefully. The sad warrior, the song of Russia, is a twice told omen. Embarking in health, anon we will unite for peace. The harmony of our muses and virgins is warmed with sorrow, but pleasing is its melody for all. What is this excerpt of Pushkin's about? Here in the song, the culture of the civilization, the people, is expressed. Warmed with sorrow, sad warrior. Pushkin thus spoke, to put it in technical terms, about the low-frequency component. It is known that if there are low-frequency and high-frequency processes, then from the position of low-frequency processes, high-frequency processes are clearly visible. But if you look at low-frequency ones from the position of high-frequency processes, then it won't be clear what is happening. The yardstick that Chuchev speaks about is the frequency. But these words, reinforcing it with Russian feeling, able to bring all together into an unbreakable whole structure, everything humanly good. This phrase, reinforcing it with Russian feeling. This Russian feeling is a completely exceptional feeling. This has allowed all the peoples who were part of the Russian civilization to, in technical terms, fit easily into these low-frequency processes of Russian culture. And by the way, Ivan Antonovich Yefremov writes about this in The Hour of the Bull. He also drew attention to the fact that there is such a low-frequency component in Russian culture. And considering this in his work as if from the distant future, he writes, "An especial place was occupied then by Russian poetry." Tretyakov answered correctly on one of the episodes of Evening with Solovyov. He kept saying to his opponents, "And what is it with this Pasternak, Brodsky? What, the culture consists only of Pasternak or something?" And they generally proclaimed Brodsky their new Pushkin, because he well knew how, you see, to light a match on his ass when he lit a cigarette. This was recently shown. Now among the youth, Stalin's popularity is growing. When one such young man was asked about Stalin on the program, he replied that Stalin was a great politician. And when asked, "Would you like to have lived in Stalin's time?" he answered positively, saying, "There I could realize my potential, but now I cannot." Stalin's power was sacred, because during the period of Comrade Stalin's power, the country was developing. Now there is no development. Everything has stopped. The main thing is that the young people have no prospects, only the elite. In general, the tribal system, everything according to family ties or ties of another kind. And in our time, when we were young, we believed, and not just believed. I received an excellent education at the Suvorov Military School. There were male and female schools. As soon as boys and girls schools were unified, the quality of education fell sharply.